Hello everyone. Welcome to our Agile Quadrants webinar. My name is Christina and I'll be your moderator. Today's webinar will be led by Logigear's co-founder, Michael Hackett. Before we begin, let me cover a few housekeeping items. First, this webinar will last about 25 minutes. We will not have a Q&A. Instead, please DM any questions you have and we'll follow up with them after the webinar. This webinar will be recorded and distributed within 48 hours. Now, let me introduce Michael and Logigear. Logigear is a leading provider of enterprise software testing solutions and test automation tools. Michael is the co-founder of Logigear. In addition to his software engineering work, Michael has provided training for Salesforce, Fidelity, Intuit, Adobe, Bank of America, and many other software producers. His training courses have brought Silicon Valley testing expertise to over 16 countries. Michael has over 2 decades of experience with software engineering, quality assurance, and testing of various applications. Michael is a certified Scrum Master and holds a Bachelor of Science degree in Engineering from Carnegie Mellon University. This is a new 2-part webinar series on Agile Testing Quadrants. In Part 1, Michael will discuss what the Agile Testing Quadrants are, how did we get here, and how does this fit into a modern SDLC. With that being said, I'm going to hand it over to Michael. Take it away, Michael.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Let's get started. So we're going to do 2 videos on the Agile Testing Quadrants. Part 1 is going to be just thinking about what the quadrants are, how did we get here in modern SDLC, how these are going to fit together into a testing strategy, and what do we have to deal with building a testing strategy? What are these tasks we're talking about? Part 2, we're going to take a much lower level look at walking through the quadrants and look at some of the issues that come up with this. Who is doing what, where, what do we do with this information, and then finally moving forward, where do we go from here? So first, the problem is, and why we even have these quadrants, is how do you test and be agile? Like, hopefully we have an idea of what agile is, and we know about the Agile Manifesto, and our teams are agile. So how do you test and be agile? That's the problem we're trying to solve here. So the way we're going to do this is, I want us to understand the thinking behind the quadrants, which is really the main goal of this, of part 1 of this 2 videos, is thinking about how this quadrant thing happens. Next, do we use this as a task list, or is it a phase, or what happens inside a sprint and outside a sprint? How this winds up getting used is really going to depend on your project and your implementation, right? So trying to figure out who's doing what and where is also a goal of this discussion. And in the end, remember that it's all going to be context-driven. Depending on your product, your style product, the devices you support, the teams, the locations, how mature your product is, how new your product is. Testing is context-driven, right? How well you know your customers, how great are your user stories, how much collaboration do you have across the whole team? We're going to have this general discussion about how this thing came about and what it is, these Agile Quadrants, and even Agile testing in general. But what you do with it and how you implement this is really going to be driven by the context of your SDLC and your tools, and how much you automate and who automates. So hopefully this discussion will tell you the information you need to have that discussion about an Agile testing strategy with your team. So the quadrants. So Brian Marek, one of the original signers of the Agile Manifesto, realized that there was a gap. There was nothing in Agile, or nothing in being discussed at the time about how you test. It's important to realize when this stuff happened. The Agile Manifesto was written in 2001. This was right after the dot-com crash. It's no accident that this all happened, that there's so much SDLC change when the dot-com crash happened. The dot-com era and then the following crash happened because working situations just changed so dramatically from traditional development to this get products done fast, get it to be the first to market. We have to beat our competitors to market. Work like crazy because you're all going to get a ton of stock and you'll retire when you're 30. And we all know how that worked out, right? It didn't. But there was so much change happened in how we develop software right in the heart of the dot-com era, followed by the dot-com crash. It's important to remember that the Agile Manifesto was signed in 2001, right? Kind of, and everything changed after that. So Brian Marek came up with this idea after that, after people had been heard about this Agile thing, and a couple of companies started being Agile and doing Agile, or whatever that meant. And Lisa Crispin and Janet Gregory wrote this book, Agile Testing. If you haven't read it, you may want to read it. It's a whole discussion of what it means to be Agile and test. And Brian Marek had come up with this quadrants thing, right? The whole purpose why you're watching this. And it really became famous through the book and got really widespread through the book and has been modified and adapted and matured. It's matured over time. So this is what the goal of us talking about today. You may have seen this diagram before, the Agile Testing Quadrants, Quadrant 1, 2, 3, and 4. We're not going to get into the low-level details here. We're going to, now that you know what we're talking about with these quadrants, testing tasks like unit testing, component tests inside the quadrants, bigger ideas like technology-facing tests or critiquing the product tests, and this idea of whether it's manual or automated, which I'm not big on the manual or automated side, but this is the discussion that we're going to have. This is the image that was published in the Agile Testing book. So if we want to take a step back and start this from where and how we tested in a traditional way, there was this traditional process flow where developers did unit testing, then there was integration testing, then we did system testing, and then we did user acceptance testing. And sometimes it was dependent on environments and not only who was doing them. Like you could have a dev environment and devs, maybe technical testers, test on the dev environment. At some point, it would wind up on a testing server where different types of tests would happen. That this also had an implication on how mature the product was, and wind up on a staging server or pre-production server that maybe you would give users access to do a beta test, a public beta, or open it up to let a specific client use the product to get real live user testing. So there was this unit testing, integration testing, system testing, user acceptance testing paradigm that had been built, and it was pretty understood who was doing what was getting automated. Well, you know, in the old days, it was only a QA team, we used to call them, right, doing test automation out here through a UI in system testing. Another way to think about this, though, for us to use in this quadrants discussion is what testing happened where. The testing that happened during unit testing is to write better code, to build a better product, right? Developers would find a bug by running unit tests. If they ran unit tests, let's say they do, did a component test, did an integration test, they would find bugs to clean up the code. They might even just try a few things, write some code, run a bunch of unit tests to see how it worked, and then pick which experiment they ran was the best. They're writing better code. At some point, you're going to start bug finding, whether it's at the integration level or API level, whatever level you're doing that. Do functional testing at maybe an individual requirement level or an individual acceptance criteria level. The function that we're trying to write, the task, the problem that we're trying to solve, does it do that thing? If I need to search, does it search? If I need to store some piece of data, does it store that piece of data? At a certain point, then, we get into building scenarios, workflows, transactions, whether you want to call them end-to-end tests. System tests traditionally meant System test means the whole entire system is complete. There might still be bugs, but nothing is mocked at this point. Back when we're doing integration testing, I could have mock databases, I could have mock services, fine. Well, once we get to system testing, most often, the system is complete, right? So I can run some end-to-end tests, and I'm not using any mock systems. This is a system that the users are going to eventually get. So it's 100% complete, and I'm finding bugs. Now I can do end-to-end tests, full transactions. Still bug finding. This might be the biggest bug finding phase you have because the product is complete. By doing an end-to-end test or even a task-based test, we're going to be finding bugs in integration. Hopefully, we're not finding too many functional bugs at this point. And then at some point, we move into user acceptance testing. One thing about, I mentioned environments, this might be environment-based. Let's talk about performance testing for a minute. When do you do performance testing? In traditional testing, or traditional process flow, we would do a performance test near the end because the system has to be complete. We're going to be using a database that's for our testing that is maybe mirrored to what's live to get the most valid performance tests results. We don't want to be running into any functional bugs. The whole system has to be complete. We might not do performance tests until we get into that environment, like a staging environment that's also going to be used for a beta test or for user acceptance testing, because that's when the system is most complete. The policies are going to be exactly what they're going to be, and we're pointing to the servers that we're going to be used for production. So we're not going to do performance testing at the end. We're not going to do performance testing till the end. Right? One thing we know about modern development is this shift left cultural idea that we want to take a bunch of these practices and shift them left as early as we can so we can find bugs earlier, right? But in traditional process flow, we didn't even have the right environment or have a full complete environment to run good performance tests until the end. Even if it was done by a separate performance testing team, they didn't have the product ready enough to do performance testing till the end. So one question I'd pose to you here is in whatever SDLC you're using now, CI/CD, Kanban, Agile, Scrum, whatever it is you're doing, who does what tasks where? Who does your low-level unit tests? Usually developers, right? When do you do performance testing and who does it? When do you do integration testing and who does it? When do you do system testing? When do you do an end-to-end transaction, a test of an end-to-end transaction, and who does it? The key thing here is, even though we're going to talk about these quadrants and we're agile now and we're trying to do DevOps or we're doing safe, scaled agile, these tasks don't go away. Acceptance testing doesn't go away, right? It's an essential part of most Scrum practices. System testing, end-to-end testing doesn't go away. Scenario testing doesn't go away. Feature level, functional testing versus feature level testing doesn't go away. This idea of the quadrants is who does what where. So we have to have this conversation even if you're not doing a traditional process flow anymore. What are the tasks you do and how are they going to get distributed now? So unit testing and component testing is pretty straightforward. That's almost always done by developers, right? People who wrote the code, whether it's TDD or just a developer running unit tests to release better code. There's usually not much discussion about who does that. There is more discussion about who does service level tests. More technical testers have taken on the roles of doing, let's say, API testing, automating it in whatever tools you're going to use. But when we get into system testing, this is where some of the tougher conversations have to have. For example, as we shift roles and developers take on bigger testing responsibilities, are they really going to take on end-to-end transaction testing? Are they going to automate it? Is there going to be a separate team that's going to work on the integrated product and do all the system testing that maybe past the story level, even past the epic level? I could be testing transactions that are whole product wide, right? Somebody has to do that kind of end-to-end transaction testing. Who's going to do that? Who's going to automate it? Who's going to be automating through the UI, right? Traditionally, or not traditionally, but typically, developers shy away from UI automation. It's a pain in the neck, higher maintenance than low-level, behind the UI unit or API level tests. So who's going to be doing that automation? And then once we get into user acceptance testing, when the system is actually finished, this is often done by other people, maybe users, maybe business analysts, systems analysts. Who knows who's going to do these tasks? These are going to be some of the tougher conversations of where does this system testing happen and who does it, and where does this user acceptance testing happen and who does it. So now let's look at the Agile Manifesto, getting into the details of this. So we're going to this Agile Quadrants and Agile Testing and Agile Testing Strategy. We know the Agile Manifesto, right? I'm not here to go over the Agile Manifesto, right? Individuals and interactions over processes and tools. You've all read this and you've been trained hopefully in what the Agile Manifesto is about. Your whole team, right, has been trained in what the Agile Manifesto is about. The thing about the Agile Manifesto, it's actually the principles on the next page from the Agile Manifesto. There's a principles list. If you go to the principles list, which I have here, the principles give a whole lot more details on what Agile development is like, right? Our highest priority is to satisfy the customers. I went through 4 years of engineering school and could write in a whole bunch of different coding languages, but nobody ever mentioned customer satisfaction. 4 years, I never once heard the phrase customer satisfaction. And now Agile says my highest priority is customer satisfaction. We could have a whole webinar just on that. Welcome changing requirements, deliver working software frequently, MVPs, or just continuous stream of value to customers. Most effective, efficient and effective way to communicate is face-to-face. Great, all this stuff is great. None of it says anything about how you test. None of it even says anything about how you write code. Right? So if we're going to be Agile, how do you write code? If we're going to be Agile, how do you test? Agile doesn't say anything about how you code and how you test. One of the reasons why I bring this up is sometimes people get a little zealous about what it means to test in Agile. And I wholly disagree with that, right? There's no best practices, right? Everything is context driven. And how you test depends on how the code is written. Depends on what kind of product you make, right? There is no one way that you test in Agile. The whole Agile Manifesto and Agile principles don't say anything about testing. Agile testing is evolving, and it's growing and changing, right? So don't think that there's just one best practice and you have to do quadrants, or you're not doing quadrants. There's just as many people who would say quadrants aren't the way to go as say it is the way to go. So when I say there's no Agile way to test, it's really going to depend on how you implement whatever these practices you want to. Scrum. Scrum is project management, right? Scrum talks about burn down and Scrum masters and sprints and estimating and doing demos and product owners. There's nothing about testing. There's nothing about development in Scrum. Scrum is project management framework. Scrum is great. Love Scrum. Couple of things about teams, though, that have implications on how we write code and how we test. That we have cross-functional teams. Cross-functional teams, we have multiple. Even if you have one role, let's say I'm a dev, I have to have multiple functions on the team, right? Devs often take on more testing responsibility. Testers take on other responsibilities. We have to be multifunctional, and there's much closer collaboration, which is a great thing. Probably the greatest thing to come out of Scrum is we work on these teams and have daily stand-ups, and the teams are responsible. Everybody owns quality. Everybody has a piece in quality. It's much closer collaboration, which is great. Where we do finally start getting some practices about modern development and modern testing is in extreme programming, which everybody knows Agile, everybody knows Scrum. Hopefully, you know extreme programming. Some of the practices have been around for a long time, like unit testing. But Kempbeck pulled these together and published a book in 1999, Extreme Programming. I have an image of the book. If you haven't read the book, get it. You can read it at lunchtime in a week. great book, um, and it really did present a bunch of ideas about modern development. So let's take a look at what I'm making this assertion that to be agile and to do Scrum, we need to be using a bunch of modern development practices. Well, we get a great exposure to this in XP. What are the XP practices? Playing the planning game, following coding standards, collective ownership of code. Think if this was written during the .com era, I could have my greatest developer really be the owner of the how the system works and the key parts of the system, and then some stupid .com comes and hires him away, and next thing I know, all my intelligence about how the product works is gone from the company. So we have to have collective ownership of code. Running customer tests, right? So we're starting to talk about tests, pair programming, refactoring, continuous integration, right? CI changed, continuous integration, whether using Jenkins or whatever auto build tool you're using. So the XP practices, particularly test-driven development, customer tests, doing CI and having a smoke test, having a build validation test, go along with the continuous integration. XP starts to talk about how do you be a developer and write more modern, use more modern practices to get your product done well. Before anybody was talking about delivering value, but how can you be sane? How can you be sane and deliver a good product, like working at a sustainable pace? And we start talking about some testing tasks. So remember, the reason why I bring this XP up is extreme programming talks about how you write code. Extreme programming talks about how you test, and not even all tests, right? If you look at a bunch of these practices, a traditional tester, even in 1999, we were doing a whole lot of other types of tests than are written here. Agile doesn't really describe how you test. Scrum doesn't describe how you test. XP actually talks about a bunch of tests, and we're doing these practices, TDD and pair programming and writing customer tests and playing the planning game and having coding standards. So it's one of the reasons why I recommend people read that XP book, because it does talk a lot about how we make software, how we write code, and how we test code these days. So we get into these quadrants, and now that we're agile, how do we test? People were agile and people were testing in agile, whether you're doing agile with Scrum and doing sprints. Before these quadrants came out, to take a really high level look at these that we're going to get into in more detail, we have technology facing tests. We have tests that are supporting the team. Let's say the Scrum team. We have business facing tests, right? User facing, business facing tests. And then we have tests that are going to be critiquing the product, and they're segmented out and quadranted off in these quadrant 1, quadrant 2, quadrant 3, quadrant 4 that we're going to look at in more detail in a minute. So what I wanted to talk about here was this idea of agile testing and what agile testing is and how we got here. So we're going to stop. Okay, so to summarize what we just talked about today in part 1, we talked about agile, what agile is, where we were in traditional development, moving into being agile, this agile thing, how we got here, what are the tasks we do and the phases that we go through, but to look at some XP practices, how these pieces fit together. So what we're going to do next is go low level and talk about individual quadrants, what happens in the individual quadrants, and you're building an agile testing strategy. So I hope you watch video number 2 and see you there.
Thank you for attending our Agile Quadrants webinar. Part 2 will debut at the same time next week. As a reminder, we will be sending out a recorded version of this webinar within 48 hours. Thank you for your time. Goodbye.